We are LifeChurch Livonia.
All right, good morning, LifeChurch Livonia. Typically, the way it works is that the pastor says good morning, and then at least someone says good morning. So good. It's so good to see you guys. My name is Brian, and I'm the pastor here, and I am so glad that you chose this morning to come and be a part of our church here at LifeChurch Livonia. And our hope is that you would find a place here that feels like family. You would find a place here where you can explore what it looks like to have a relationship with God. And we just love being here, and we love being here with you. And if I've never had a chance to meet you, I'd love to meet you after the service today. And so make sure you hunt me down and find me, because I would love to make sure that we connect face to face. As we grow, it's really important that we continue to know each other. And so it's part of the reason why we have you guys talk in the service like we just did. I know that our introverts are like, please, can I just come to church after that moment? And we do that on purpose because we want you guys to actually not just come to church, but actually become that family. And the only way you're going to do that is to get to know each other. And so thanks for letting us urge you towards that. And so we're in the middle of a series, and I've loved it. It's called Goodbye Religion. And it's got a title that might be kind of confusing for people, because you're coming here and you're thinking, isn't Christianity a religion? And why would they want us to say goodbye to that? And so I thought it'd be good, just as we wrap up that series today, just to kind of remind us of why we're doing this. And I think the best way to do that is to talk first a little bit about a guy that I really admire a lot of his writings. He's a Christian author. His name is Peter Scazzero. He's a pastor from the New York area. And Peter Scazzero has written books that are designed to help us get healthy emotionally, so that we can get healthy relationally and get healthy spiritually, ultimately. And one of the things that he regularly says in his books is that sometimes we have to go back in order to go forward. We have to go back in order to go forward, meaning that we have to look back at our family of origin to see where are the places that my family of origin, not just my parents, but going back further than that, what are the places in my family of origin where we have detoured off the path that is healthiest? What are the ways, the practices, the different things that we do in my family? What were the tragedies in my family that caused us to leave the path of health? And we go back, we address those issues, and then we are correcting them in our life so that we can move forward into health, emotionally, relationally, spiritually. And I love that. And I've seen it becoming such a powerful tool for so many people. And we do that through just exploring those areas of our life. We do it through prayer. We do it through the power of God to heal those spots that are wounded in our life. But in the same way, I think not only do we need to go back personally into our personal family of origin, but as the church, we need to take a pause once in a while and look back at the history of our faith and ask ourselves the question, are we actually on the path, the religious path, the path that Jesus invited us onto in the first place? Are we actually on that path? Or are there places in our family of origin in terms of faith where we have gone off the path? And so what this entire series is about is looking at the life and the ministry of Jesus and the way that he enabled us to say goodbye to the old way of doing religion and step into a brand new type of relationship that was never possible before. And so we really want to look closely and ask the question, does our life, does our religion, does our church fit into the model of Jesus or not? And if it doesn't, we have some work to do. We have some corrective measures to do. And what we need to realize as we go back is that the world that Jesus stepped into was a world that was filled with religion. Almost everyone was religious. We've talked about this in the last few weeks. Almost everyone was religious. From the most bloodthirsty of the general of armies, the person who was conquering other nations, they were probably religious. Their religion just supported their behavior. From that kind of a bloodthirsty general all the way down to a simple farmer who was just longing to have a family. They were almost all religious, and the religions that they adhered to mostly followed a really similar model that got replicated all throughout the known world at that time. And the model was this. We call it the temple model. There were sacred places. And so what that means is that there was a specific piece of geography, there was a building, there was a location that was holy and people needed to go to get right with God or to experience and to step into what it looked like to be a follower or adherent of that particular religion. And at that sacred place, there was almost always some type of sacred text. And the sacred texts were simply the way that they'd written out what they believed. There were often lists of rules of what you needed to do in order to be a good follower of that religion. And at the sacred places, holding the sacred texts were almost always sacred men. And it was almost always men that were the people who kind of guarded the sanctity of that religion, who were the ones who interpreted the sacred texts and the rules that were contained within those sacred texts. And sometimes even those sacred men would add additional rules on to the ones that were in the sacred texts, and they would teach those to the sincere followers. So picture it. People coming to a sacred place, listening to the sacred men, talk about the sacred texts and all the other things that the sacred men added to the sacred texts, and then trying their very best to live their lives in such a way that proved that they were sincere followers. And what I want to do today is I want to camp for a little bit on this idea of the sacred men adding rules. I want to stop there for a minute and just really lean into this and talk about how are we still living out the reality of that? Because Jesus, this is the world he stepped into. And Jesus was Jewish, and our faith has its roots in Judaism. And so even in that model, they followed this temple model. And most of their sacred text was our Old Testament, is our Old Testament. And so we have to ask the question, why did the sacred men add those rules? In addition to what was in the sacred text, they were adding additional things on. Why did they do that? And I think the first reason is this, is that there was a genuine interest in helping people draw closer to God. I think most of these priests, these teachers, these rabbis, they had a genuine interest in helping people grow closer, draw closer to God. So they would add rules to help kind of give a framework for them to live out their faith. So I really want to believe that most of the time it was sincere, it was genuine. But then there were other people that, especially in kind of some places where people began to struggle, or maybe they got a little power hungry inside Judaism and outside of Judaism, that were adding rules in a way that was designed to control people around them. It was simply a way of manipulating people, managing people, sometimes a way to increase the amount of money that was given. They taught people different and new and additional rules that would somehow capture them and enslave them to that system of belief. And so in Jesus' situation, in the Jewish world that Jesus was born into, we find the sacred text, the rules contained in the sacred text in our Old Testament. And it made up what we call the law given by God. These are the laws that God gives for the best interest of the people. There were civil laws. There were ceremonial laws. There were moral laws. Things that the civil laws were designed to kind of create an environment that people lived in that was orderly and made sense because they were more than just a religion. They were a nation. So they needed those civil laws. The ceremonial laws were the things that they did to make sure that they were right with God. The laws of cleanliness and things you couldn't touch and things you could touch and things you needed to do and things you shouldn't do that helped you get clean, right? With Jesus, with God. And then there were the moral laws, the things that you are just things that you shouldn't do, the things that were called sin. The things that you might engage in, the activities or the thoughts, the actions that you engaged in that departed from God's best for your life. And into this world, Jesus stepped. In the Jewish world, there were approximately 613 rules, 613 laws that people were expected to know. If you were Jewish, you were expected to know this. They would teach them in their oral tradition. And you're standing before God and you're standing before your community was in part determined by your ability to get it right, to follow correctly the 613 laws in the way that the priest or the rabbi or the teacher of that area said you needed to. And what happened is that the 613 weren't enough. And these different teachers, these rabbis, would add additional rules on. They called it their yoke. And we don't have time to teach too much about it. They were the teachings that particular Jewish rabbi was saying, in addition to the 613 laws in the Old Testament, these are the additional things you need to do to be my follower and to live your life in a way that pleases and honors God and gives you standing within the community. There were thousands of additional laws. And what ended up happening for many people is that those rules, those laws, they felt suffocating. It felt impossible to live fully into that. Right? And so there were times when if you moved to a new community that had some laws you weren't aware of, then you would break them without even knowing you were breaking them. Has anyone ever broken an unspoken expectation or an unspoken law that maybe existed in a family? Sure, you probably have. And so Jesus kind of comes into this space where there's all of these rules. And this was the world that he lived in. And some of you don't have to work really hard to imagine what that would be like, right? Maybe you grew up in a family that had a ton of rules, a very strict family. Maybe you grew up in a family that not only did they have spoken rules, but there were unspoken rules about how you lived in that family, and you knew when you broke them, right? Or you knew when your friend came over and walked into the living room that no one's allowed to go into, that still has the carpet lines, you know what I'm talking about? And mom's like, someone went into the living room. I can see your footprints. That's a law. One does not. My friend Gary, growing up, they had a room in the front of their house. You walked in the front of their front door, and on the right was a room that no one went into. The carpet was perfect. It was like a museum. It was an unspoken rule that became spoken really quickly if you violated it. So some of us, we know what this feels like, right? To live in a situation that there's rules you're trying to follow, and it creates an uneasiness, I think, in our souls, especially if we don't really feel like we know them well. We know what this is like. Maybe you experienced it in your family of origin. Maybe you experienced it in the church that you grew up in. That you went to a church that was really clear about what the rules were, what the list was of things you weren't allowed to do and the things you had to do to be accepted, to be a part. And so in the decades prior to now, a lot of times what people would say is that you have to believe before you can belong. You have to believe before you can belong. And what you do is I have to believe all those lists. I have to adhere to all these lists before I'm allowed to join in and be a part of what God's doing in this church. And maybe you actually have been gone from church for a long time because you felt suffocated by that list. And you felt constantly like you were a failure. And you're checking out church again today and wondering what lists we have. What are the lists that I'm going to find here at LifeChurch Livonia? What are the things that Brian, as the pastor, is going to ask me to do? And how does that line up with what my life looks like? Am I able to do it? Am I capable of doing it? Did I mess up already? That's not our hope for you. Our hope for you here at LifeChurch Livonia is that you would come here and you would find a place that isn't defined by rules. It's not that rules aren't important. I'm not preaching anarchy. What I'm saying is that we want to be a place that isn't defined by the rules, that we are a place that is defined by love. That we become a church that starts and begins and ends in love, and begins and ends with grace. Begins and ends with an openness and acceptance to say, come, everyone, come. This is a place for you. You can come however you are, and our prayer is that you wouldn't leave just the way you are, that God would change you. God would transform you, that God would heal you. We want to be a place that isn't defined by rules, but a place that is defined by love. We want to be a place where real people can meet a real God, to live in real life, not pretend life, not the kind of life where you there are certain things that your parents do or that you do during the week that you're not allowed to talk about at church, right? It's like no one knows that your family does X, Y, Z because no one talks about that in small group or at church. And if you share it during prayer time, you are in trouble because you broke the rules. You violated the list. We believe that Jesus is inviting you into life and life to the full. And when Jesus came, he changed everything. And one of the things he allowed us to say goodbye to was we could say goodbye to the suffocating lists. Goodbye to the suffocating lists. It's a beautiful, beautiful thing. And I love, as we go back and we look at his ministry, we look at the words that he spoke, the things he told people. One of my favorite moments is when a bunch of the religious teachers of the day were trying to get him to identify which part of the list was his favorite. And they say to him this, they say, Jesus, what's the greatest commandment? What's the greatest law? And this is how Jesus replies. He says, Jesus replied, love the Lord your God with all of your heart and with all of your soul and with all of your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law, meaning all the rules, the entire list, everything that you've been taught as a Jewish follower of God, everything you've been taught, the entire law and all the writings and the words spoken by the prophets, all of it hangs on these two commandments. I want you to imagine that the entire list, the entire law, and everything that had been taught to the people up to that point is hanging on two hinges, right? Imagine a door, and the entire weight of the door is supported by those two hinges. And the hinge that Jesus is talking about is love. Love of God, love of people. This is what Jesus tells them. Love God, love people, the two hinges that everything else you've been taught, everything else you're about, everything else we are calling you into is dependent upon these things. He took something that was incredibly complex and he made it simple. And so I think that they really surprised the teachers in that moment because they weren't expecting that. Probably what they were hoping is that he would say something that violated their list, right? So they could hammer him on it and say, you messed up. You're clearly not from God. And they would ostracize him as a result of his failure to answer their question correctly. They thought he would screw up somehow. Or maybe they were hoping that he would give some beautiful, deep, intellectual, complex answer that they then could debate for hours and try to poke holes in because it was fun for them to do that. But he did nothing like they expected. He did nothing like they expected because Jesus didn't come to make life more complex. He came to make it simple. Jesus didn't come to add rules, to make life more complex. Jesus came to make life simple for you and I, to make it simple for us to access God, to engage God, to have a relationship with God. He stripped the complexity away and didn't add rules like a typical teacher of that time. He began to simplify the rules and boil them down to their very essence. This is so beautiful. And it's because of that we are here today. He took the incredibly complex temple model and made it accessible to all of us. And here's what I struggle with, is that even though Jesus, he died so that we could have that opportunity, we're still struggling with it today. We're still struggling with it today. Instead of saying, this is what you have to do, Jesus said, let me show you what I'm going to do. Instead of giving us a list, he said, I'm just going to do something. And it's going to be beautiful. And it's actually going to make that some of the ceremonial laws that you had, it's going to make them unnecessary anymore. You're not going to need those. All of the rituals you go through to purify yourself, I'm going to take care of that. As he sat with his followers at one point, he said this, John 15, my command is this, love each other. As I have loved you, greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. Jesus did this. He said, let me show you what love looks like. And of course, when you think of Jesus laying down his life for his friends, you think of the cross. You think of the crucifixion of Jesus, literally going to his death, dying on their behalf, becoming the once and for all sacrifice to make things right between us and God. You immediately go to that, but I think it was bigger than that. Jesus didn't, I think, it wasn't just a singular death for him. It was a daily dying to preferences and to self on behalf of other people, loving them, engaging them. We struggle with this. We struggle setting aside our own agendas, our own plans, our own list of rules, spoken and unspoken, in order to love other people. And he says, you got to learn to daily die to self so that you can love other people. Love your friends, love your family, love your spouse. And once again, even though Jesus died, even though he did that, to free us from the temple model, to free us from this suffocating lists, even though he did that, we've spent the last 2,000 years trying to create new lists. We've spent the last 2,000 years trying to create new lists. And you go back and you say, you look at the earliest gathering of the church, and you ask yourself the question, what was the earliest gathering of Christians known for? They were known for a couple things, really. They were known for the way they loved each other. Extravagant, ridiculous, unparalleled love for one another. That's what they were known for. And so actually other people, we've talked about this before, other organizations, even some of the people that were in the government at that time, they tried to model some of what they did after the Christians, because they were like, we got to do what they're doing, because everyone's flocking to them because they're doing these love feasts and they're doing these love gatherings and they're just loving on one another. And they couldn't replicate it because they weren't rooted in the second thing that the Christians were known for, which was rooted in Jesus. Tied to, attached to, loyal to, followers of Jesus. They were known for their love, and they were known for their passionate clinging on to, holding on to of Jesus. This was the early church. So we're going back so that we can go forward. Their structures were simple. Their rules were simple. Their worship was simple. This is beautiful. This is the path of Jesus. It's so interesting that some of the earliest arguments we see that come up in the church, even in the first couple decades after Jesus was gone, some of their biggest arguments that we see recorded in the book of Acts were arguments about which of the previous rules they still had to follow now that they were followers of Jesus. They would argue about this. Peter and Paul, two of the most famous early Christians, some of the most famous early followers of Jesus, actually argued at times, and other disciples even argued about what rules still apply to us. So even just a few decades after Jesus, they were already starting to struggle with what lists they needed to follow, even though Jesus had made it clear that there was really an essence to this faith that was love. It's super interesting. And then you see, if you flash forward a little bit further, around 300 years after the time of Jesus, you see the Roman Empire, especially the Constantine, who was an emperor, who suddenly legitimizes Christianity. Apparently, people say that he had this vision of the cross, and he believed that it helped him to conquer people. And so he suddenly was open to this idea of Christianity. Up until then, it had been illegal to be a Christian, and Christianity was still flourishing because all they needed was Jesus and love. And so he legalizes Christianity. And not only does he legalize it, he passes laws about taxes. And so people were becoming Christians because now it was acceptable. Not only was it acceptable, but it actually was like socially the cool thing to do. And then they would dedicate their properties to God so they didn't have to pay taxes. And now they're holding on to wealth, and they're holding on to power, and they're using new lists and new rules to control and to manipulate and to define boundaries of who was in and who was out. And then around the year 325, after Jesus' death, Constantine calls a council together to Rome to decide what the new list was of what they believed. And the list they came up with was beautiful. We still use it in our worship today at times. It's called the Nicene Creed. There's beautiful things in that creed, but it was, once again, the beginnings of new lists that clearly defined who was in and who was out. And once again, hear me clearly. I'm not saying the Nicene Creed is a bad thing. The thing I struggle with about something like the Nicene Creed is who called the meeting? The emperor. Why? Because we wanted to define it. We wanted to control it. Who is in? Who is out? And beginning the process, once again, of suffocating lists. that created issues, that led to wars, and no longer is the core of the Christian faith about loving God and loving people. Now it comes down to things like power and conquest and authority and nationalism. It's a slippery slope as we engage in institutionalized Christianity. We need structures. We need rules. We need, at times, we need boundaries, right? We need all of that. But the problem is that people begin to believe that life came from the rules when life comes from Jesus. The rules are important, but life doesn't come from the rules. Life doesn't come from adhering to a set list or prescribed doctrine. Life comes from Jesus at the center of it all. Loving God and loving people. I want you to hear me really clearly. This doesn't mean that sin doesn't exist. It doesn't mean that there's not right and wrong. It doesn't mean that right morality doesn't exist anymore. It does. Jesus actually said, I didn't come to abolish the entire law. I came to fulfill it. And the parts of the law that still actually apply to us are the parts about our morality. About what is sin and what isn't sin. Those still exist. But we have to realize that Jesus is at the core of it. And what they were doing here in the Holy Roman Empire, hear it? In the Holy Roman Empire, what they were doing is that they were defining, how do you know whether you're a Christian or not? You're a Christian if you went to the right church. You were a Christian if you followed the right creed. I'm telling you, wars were fought over creeds. Thousands and thousands of people died over doctrine. You were a Christian if you confessed to the right priest. And if then after you confessed to the right priest, you said the right prayers as a result of that. You were a Christian if you sang the right songs. We still fight about that in the Christian church today. Today. I went to a church about a decade ago, a little more than a decade ago, that almost broke up in two because they fought over which songs were the right songs. There were lists of acceptable, approved, and lists of ones that weren't. You're a Christian if you abstained from the right sins. But other ones were okay. No one talked about it. Suddenly, it's starting to smell like the temple model again. Suddenly, it's starting to smell like the very thing that Jesus came to set us free from. And so we go back to Jesus again and again and again, day after day, week after week. And we go back to John chapter 13, once again, talking to his followers. He says, a new command I give you, love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another. This is so incredibly simple. It's not easy, but it's simple. It's like the simplest game of Simon Says you've ever played. Really, let's play. Ready? Let's practice. Simon Says, raise your hands. Right? You did it. You all win, right? Now put your hands down. Simon didn't say it, so you lost, okay? Some of you over here, because you're a rule follower, right? We're rule followers, like he didn't say, Simon didn't say. Jesus says, listen, a new command I give you. Love one another. Jesus says, love one another. This is how they'll know that you are my follower. No tricks, no added rules, no additional commandments that you got to memorize. By this, they will know that you're my follower. So what do we see over and over again in the New Testament? What do we see over and over again from Jesus? Is that love will be the authenticating mark that you are a follower of Jesus. Love will be and is the authenticating mark that you follow Jesus. That's what Jesus is saying to us. He said it to his followers back 2,000 years ago, and he says it to you and I today. My wife loves the shoes made by Tom's. I don't know if you're familiar with these. She loves Toms, right? They're comfortable. They become like an everyday shoe. And her first pair of Toms, she loves so much that they begin to get holes in them, right? And so she decided, I need a new pair of Toms. And instead of paying full price, because they can be kind of expensive, she thought, I'm going to look for a bargain. Because that's what we do, right? We look for bargains. We look for what loopholes, ways we can go around like the full price item. And so she goes online and she finds this manufacturer, this online seller that claims to have discounted Toms. And so she orders them, right? And they come in the mail a while later, a little longer probably than they should have taken because they came from a different country. And when she got them and put them on, they just didn't feel right. They didn't quite look right. They weren't the same as their old Toms. And she began to wonder, are these real? Like, I'm not sure that these are actual authentic Toms. So what do? I get online and I'm looking on the web on the web for what are the authenticating marks of a real set of authentic Toms. And there actually are all sorts of things you can look for. You can look for the way the stitching is done. You can look for where they put the labels. You can look for the type of materials they use, the way the sole is adhered to the shoe, right? And all of those things allow you to know whether or not what you're putting on your feet is an authentic Tom. And in the same way, Jesus says to his followers, they will know you are my followers if you love God, love people. That is the authenticating mark that you are a follower of Jesus. It's interesting because even Paul, the Apostle Paul, who honestly was like the rule follower of all rule followers, he was known for being an excellent rule follower. That's what was his jam. It was like his claim to fame was that he followed the rules. He did exactly what the law said to do. Not only the 613 laws, but the additional ones that had been added on top of that. He did it. Like he was killing it when it came to rules. And so when he met Jesus, and his life was transformed because of his encounter with Jesus. And he began to then speak about the good news of what Jesus brought and the life transformation that Jesus brought and the love and grace that Jesus brought. You would expect that he would continue to struggle with being a rule follower, that he would be the guy defending the rules and trying to mix in a little bit of the old with a little bit of the new. But instead, he wasn't like that at all. He was the guy defending freedom. He was the guy defending the setting free that Jesus brought from those suffocating lists. Paul was probably a little like my friend Elena Claire. I was just in New York City at a church planting conference this past week with her. And we got to the edge of the street. You know, if you've ever been in New York City, you know, it's like a mass of humanity. It's almost like you're in a river of people. And when it's time to cross the street, everyone goes and you better go, right? But she couldn't force herself to cross the street when the hand said orange. Couldn't do it. She was the first day she was there, she was like, it's orange, it's orange. And people are just like an island in the river. People are flowing around her and jostling her, and she just couldn't make herself cross the street when the hand was orange. It was like the third day we got there, and she said, watch this, Brian. Everyone started to go, and she was like, I'm crossing the street, and it's orange. I'm breaking the rules, people. But she was dying inside the whole time, right? You would expect that would have been Paul when it came to living out his Christian faith, his faith in Jesus. But it wasn't at all. In fact, you go to a place like his letter to the Galatians, where they're having some struggle in the church because a bunch of the people there are saying that in order to be a part of the church, you had to be circumcised. It was an old rule, an old law. And they were saying, you have to be circumcised or else you can't come here. And Paul was like, whoa, wait, that's an old rule. It's an old rule. And this is what he says. Galatians 5:1. He says, it is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Stand firm then, and do not let yourself be burdened again by the yoke of slavery. Remember earlier I told you that the list of rules were often called yokes, right? He says, stand firm then, and do not let yourselves again be burdened by the list of rules that feel like a suffocating list. Jesus died and rose again to set you free from that. Don't go back to it. Don't go back to a place where you're defining your standing with God by how good of a job you do following the list, because that is a faith and a religion that is dependent upon what I do when our faith is dependent upon what he did. This is critical, and Paul is advocating for it. And he goes on and he says this, and just a few verses later, he says, the only thing that counts is faith expressing itself through love. Could it be any more clear? Jesus was clear. Paul was clear. It's simple, but we keep trying to make it complex because there is still a little bit of the temple model in every single one of us. There's still a little bit of the temple model in you and in me. If you grew up in Western culture, somewhere in the West, in America or North America, period, you probably have a little bit of the temple model in you. You probably have a little bit of that rule follower. Either longing to know what the rules are so you can follow them, or longing to know what the rules are so you can break them. Right? Some of you are like, amen, that's me. There's still probably a little bit of the temple model. So let me ask you some questions. I think it'll help you to see some of the spaces. We could do this all day. Like little marks that you still have a little bit of that in you. Have you ever wondered, put yourself in this place, have you ever wondered what the church is against, and then compared the list that you got back from the church with your own life to determine whether or not you actually could believe in God? Let me explain that to you. This happens to me regularly. We've talked about this from the pulpit before. We've said, listen, there are people that come to me who aren't followers of Jesus who ask me the question, what is your church against? And I rarely engage that conversation. I usually say, I'd rather talk about what we're for. But the reason they're asking that question is because they want to know what we're against so they can compare the list of things we're against to their life to determine whether or not they are willing to believe in our God. If you've ever wondered what the church is against or asked that question, because of that intent, there may be a little temple model in you still. If you've ever wondered how close to sinning you can get without ticking God off, you may have a little temple model in you. You're like, how far can I go? What can I do? Like, okay, here's the list of rules. I get it. Which ones are most important? Like, there's got to be a couple that aren't a big deal. How far can I go in whatever activity or ever thought pattern I'm in before God gets angry? If that's, you're thinking that you may have some temple model in you. Still, asking the wrong question. How far can I go? It's not a question of saying, what can I be doing to learn to love God more and to experience his love more so that I can give more of his love out? It's saying, what can I do to, how far can I go before I jeopardize that love? And the answer is, it doesn't matter how far you go. You can never jeopardize God's love for you. It's the wrong question. And if you're asking it, you may have a little bit of the temple model in you. You may have a little bit in you still if you've ever felt more guilty about missing church or missing mass than you do about the way you treated your coworker yesterday. If you've ever felt more guilty about missing some moment of institutional worship than you feel about the way you treat the people around you, then you may have a little bit of the temple model in you. This one hits home. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't come to church. We should. But we don't come out of guilt. We come because we are invited to participate in the worship and the expression of the love of God every single Sunday. Jesus came to make it really simple. And we're still working really hard to make it more complex. Rather than asking, how far can I go? What can I get by with? What is legal and what is illegal? What did I do last time, or what did they do differently last time? Instead of asking, we need a new sermon on that. Like, I'm not sure what to do. Can you just tell me? Preach it? How far is far enough? How much is enough? We have to stop asking those questions. And once again, I want you to be really clear. I am not saying that good choices aren't important. I'm not saying that rules are irrelevant. Choices are incredibly important. The way we choose to live our life, the things we do every single day are so important that we're going to do a whole series on it starting this next week. It's called I Choose, learning to make good decisions. It is very important. But life doesn't come from rules. Life comes from Jesus. And at the core of Christianity, at the core of our religion is this question: what does love require of me? What does love require of me? That's what we ask ourselves. What does love require of me? This is what the journey of a Christian is about. It's about experiencing God's love and then in turn showing that love to the people around us. Love is the authenticating mark of the follower of Jesus. It is the authenticating mark of the follower of Jesus. And so today, as we go to communion, as we go to this table, we begin to view it maybe in a different way. That communion isn't something we do because the law tells us we have to do it. Communion isn't something we simply do because it's a checklist on our week. Communion is an opportunity for us to experience and engage in love, the embodiment of love, which is Jesus. He said, greater love has no man than if he laid down his life for his brother, for his friend. And the night before Jesus was betrayed, he sat down with those brothers and he picked up a piece of bread and he broke it. He said, this is my body broken for you. You want to know how much I love you? This much. You don't want to know how far I'm willing to go? This far. My body broken for you. Love lived out. And in the same way, after supper, he took the cup and he said, this cup, it's a new covenant, a new promise, a new opportunity for you to live in a relationship with me. This is my blood poured out for you, love embodied in Jesus' actions and his life for you and I, so that we could be right with God forever, so that we could live a life that was no longer defined by the rules. So we could live a life where our relationship with God is no longer determined by how good of a job we do following the rules, but so that we could be an intimate, personal, deep, beautiful relationship with God. He says, as often as you eat the bread and you drink the cup, you proclaim my act of love. You proclaim my death until I come again. This is what Jesus says to us. And here's one of the most beautiful parts about communion, about this moment of worship, that what's required of you, scripturally speaking, what we see in the Bible that's required of you and I to participate in this, what's required of you when the baskets come by in a minute and there's crackers in there that represent the body of Christ and little cups with juice in it, what's required of you to eat that and drink that is to say yes to that love of God. That's what's required. There's not a long list of rules. There's not a checklist you have to go through. The question is, are you willing and ready to accept and receive the love of God? To allow the love of God to transform you, to change you, to draw you into a place you've never been before. And if you're ready and you're willing, even if you have walked in here a non-Christian today, you can actually participate. And when the cup is passed, you can take one and drink it. And when the bread is passed, you take one and you eat it. And this is the beauty of what Jesus did, to come and take something that was complex and make it simple. I love this. It's who we are at the core of our faith. And so I want to pray for you. I want to pray for us today, because some of you walked in here today and you are holding God at arm's length because you are terrified of the rules, because you know you break them. Well, guess what? So do I. That's what unifies us, that we are all struggling sinners. And what can unify us is our receptivity to the love of God, to wash away that sin, to wash away that guilt, to wash away that shame. Today can be that day. Or maybe you've been a follower of Jesus for a really long time, but you're still living a rules-based life. You haven't experienced the grace of God. You don't allow yourself, because there's still a little voice in your head over and over again that condemns you. calls you a rule breaker, tells you that you're not right with God, the voice is a liar. You were invited to the table. If you say yes to Jesus, this is for you. Would you pray with me? Jesus, I'm so overwhelmed, so grateful that you were willing to take love to the furthest extreme. God, I am so grateful that you came and made something that was complex and at times difficult to follow and was often a barrier between God and people, and you stripped it all away. You stripped it all away and you said, I'm going to take what was complex, I'm going to make it simple, and I'm going to extend it to everyone. And the invitation stands today, God, and I'm so grateful for it. And so today, God, we are in this place ready and willing to receive that invitation today to step onto the path you've called us to. And so if you are in this place right now and in the midst of our prayer right now, and you are feeling how far away from God you are feeling how bound up you are by rules and by fear and by doubt, by regulation. If you're feeling today the woundedness that comes from a family of origin that had crazy strict rules that you never felt like you could follow and you always felt like you were failing. If you're here today and you came from a church that beat you up and beat you down, today is the day to say yes to Jesus' love. Right now, I just encourage you in the quiet of your own heart to say to Jesus, I choose you. I choose to be the recipient of your love. I choose to experience your love, God, today. I choose to believe today, God, that your love is enough to cover everything. Help me to experience it. And then once I've experienced it, fill me with it so that I could give it to others. I commit my journey to you. I commit myself to stepping back onto that path or onto that path for the very first time. We choose you, Jesus. Thank you for your love. We pray these things in the name of Jesus.